I'm Scott Hanselman. This is another episode of Hansel Minutes. Today, I'm chatting with Dr. Kat Hicks. She's a doctor of philosophy and research and experimental psychology, a psychologist for software teams, and you run the developer success labs at Pluralsight. How are you?
I'm doing pretty okay at this moment. Social science always feels like it has an important place in the world, but I'm pretty fired up about the place it has right now. So,
yeah. Now, you are a PhD in psychology, but you focus on the psychology of software teams. Do you have a background in coding as well?
I have a background in teaching myself to code in order to get things done that I want to get done, which I think resonates with a lot of folks. I don't have a computer science background, but I have a social science background. So in psychology, we tend to focus on things like how do we measure big human experiences? How do we develop research methodologies that serve that? But in that work, you have to learn a lot about data. You have to learn a lot about statistics. So I kind of came into being curious about coding from the side of just needing to solve a bunch of complicated statistics problems. So with respect to all of my wonderful developer friends, I don't call myself a developer, but I do write a lot of code if we want to measure by lines of code.
Yeah.
We probably
well, is there a difference between like a self-taught developer? I mean, Pluralsight's all about self-taught developers. I used to call it Netflix for self-taught developers. That's like the whole point is teach yourself to code. Like other than the formality of a degree, I don't really think there's
no. I think self-taught, taught by, having a degree or not, like that's one of the beautiful things about software as an industry is there are so many routes in. I don't work as a software developer myself, but I consider myself a partner to software developers, always listening to them. I actually co-author some research with software developers on our research team sometimes. So I like to tell engineering teams imagine having a psychologist, like they're at your side, like they're at your elbow to ask questions. That's the role I kind of play.
Now, there's a couple of words, because I'm a developer, I want to parse out on your website at drkathicks.com. And the two words are empirical and quantitative. You run an empirical research lab and you are a quantitative scientist. That, as a non-PhD and a non-psychologist, I think of psychology as being somewhat squishy, but those words are not squishy words. Can you help me reconcile that?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I say empirical because it is basically a shared practice that we as scientists out there in the world, and I mean scientists really broadly, so social scientists, behavioral scientists, all the way down to, or across, let's not do up and down, but across to lab scientists and folks that you might think of when you hear the word science, like people who do biology work, or people who do chemistry. We all have shared agreements about how science and experiments and the scientific method and creating evidence should work. And so psychologists have their own version of this. And indeed, we do work on things that can be very hard to measure. Like that's an extremely true, accurate instinct of yours to say, well, human experience is very complicated. It's difficult to measure. But I do like to tell people as well, measuring the light that comes to us from stars is also clouded by atmospheric dust and has measurement error in it. So in psychology, if we do empirical work, we try to go measure phenomena in the world. We try to understand effects, just like any scientist. We actually create a lot of statistics and math that other scientific fields use. So shout out, to psychology for that. And together we work on creating empirical evidence in these worlds. So, there's a lot of different pieces we could go into. Quantitative to me as well means that I put numbers to things. So I focus, for instance, in the Developer Success Lab, among many other things, on creating some scales that we use to measure complex behavioral experiences of developers. So for instance, do you feel like you belong on your software team? This is a hard thing to get at. You can get at it in a research interview. I actually love and use qualitative methods as well. But the quantitative side of it includes saying, well, let's come up with, a survey that's really, really good that we've tested across thousands of people and it performs pretty well and it predicts other things that we care about. It's a good signal, right? It's a thing that we've come up with to help guide us. Yeah.
It seems like right now, without staying somewhat oblique, we are in a time where people seem to be wanting to go with their gut and their intuition. And if your intuition says it's so, then you declare this is so. But facts are still facts. Do facts still apply in the world of of psychology? Like, do humans, as a general rule, always act in this way? I'm sure that there's a bell curve and that there's extremes on both sides, but as a general rule, I can test something in science, I can test something with physics and light, like you used the example of space and
Mm.
light, and it is reliably reproducible.
Yes. So all of science has to ask itself, we gathered up some really specific evidence and we're limited human beings. And will that evidence hold up? Like, will it generalize? That's a good, word there and that you kind of used. Um, and psychology asks this question as well. And we're a human field, so we have incomplete evidence about things, but we do see a lot of really interesting, helpful things that we can lean into and learn from when we're trying to generalize about human behavior. So, sense of belonging is actually a good example. We've seen that if we measure sense of belonging, it predicts real world outcomes and real world behaviors. So if you join a field and you feel like you really belong in it, you're more likely to persist, you're more likely to stay in a degree, you're more likely to earn good grades, outcomes that people tend to feel are very tangible, very real, right?
Mm-hmm.
And on the other hand, a big part of psychology is also, I'd say, the flip side. It's saying, where do the things we think are rules actually fall down? So, for instance, if you really love your work and you feel a strong sense of belonging, but you're not getting enough money to buy your groceries, sense of belonging won't keep you in that field. So I think that we're allowed to both look for generalizable rules, but also a big part of science is asking, where's the context where these rules don't apply? So we get to do both things, actually. It's very hard work.
Why do something like sense of belonging right now
Mm,
feels like an important thing, but it feels like some people can really dismiss it?
mm,
Like, just suck it up, Kat. Why don't you just work? What I mean, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps and just do the thing, right?
yeah.
But if you're literally describing that, like, business will be better if people feel like they belong. Like, if the goal here is capitalism and spinning the capitalism meter, then a business person should be interested in the fact that, hey, your developers all don't feel like they belong. Therefore, products are slipping, schedules are slipping, developer happiness is low.
Yeah.
Why would not the people on the political spectrum who are most interested in business, why would they not be all in on your kind of work?
Mm. So I think that we tend to believe we have this kind of pervasive stereotype that technical work comes from isolated software developers grinding. And
Mm,
but
the
this might feel
geniuses.
familiar. Yeah, geniuses, 10x developers, people who are kind of isolated. And what's interesting and tricky about this is that these beliefs aren't wrong. Like, in some way, there's grains of truth in them. I
Hmm.
think that when we activate those beliefs way too much and that's all we see, it leads us in the wrong direction. But believing that you need focus time is ultimately makes a lot of sense. And seeing yourself grinding, I mean, you can see that sometimes be a thing you have to do. The problem is that we also have these kind of shared normative beliefs across like our team or across our organization. So think of it this way, like, have you ever been on a team where, you sort of start picking up just this feeling that like you shouldn't tell them that you went home early,
Yeah,
or
yeah.
right?
The
Yeah.
vibes are off.
Exactly. That's our minds are always scanning our environments and asking, like, what does the success mean here? How are other people going to think about success here? Now, this concerns me a lot on software teams because I think baked into what we need to happen for innovation to happen and problem solving to happen in this culture, my research looks into this, is that we actually really need to surround people with these cultures of things like that might feel squishy or that we might have neglected. So, for example, I've done a research study. We looked at 1,282 different developers and we measured their sense of belonging and we measured whether they felt like they had that time to learn and all of these things that felt more squishy. And then we also asked them to report to us, how productive were you in the last month? And we can, there's the quantitative empirical side. We can actually statistically significantly see folks who are on teams with a high sense of belonging say, I'm more productive. They also report that their teams are more effective. We find that in my research as well. So these are quite measurable things. In fact, I think a lot of the time we're just not measuring it.
Yeah. You had a really interesting paper on code review anxiety.
Mm.
And again, I call out the juxtaposition between the very hard code review, it's very scientific, and then
Mhm.
anxiety, which could
Mhm.
arguably be presented by some as being a squishy human thing. And one could point at that and go, well, suck it up, don't be anxious. But
And people do.
people are anxious, and that's a thing. And
Yeah,
code review anxiety like doesn't just impact individual humans and make them feel some kind of way, but it literally makes the organization less successful. And you've proven that in your paper.
absolutely. We found that, we measured avoidance behaviors. So if you're feeling this anxiety, how likely are you to do stuff like not do the code review at all or just mentally check out of it? Like you probably can think about if you've ever been in a situation where you're just like, I'm just going to get through this.
Hmm.
Don't want to be here. Don't want to be having this experience that's called avoidance. And we see that happen a lot. Like one of the ways this works in your mind, in your cognition, is that anxiety draws on the same resources in your mind and from your brain as problem solving does. Because it is a form of problem solving. You're just trying to problem solve about your social experience. So there's a direct connection there. Like you can't use as much of your working memory for code if you're using it to worry that your colleagues are looking to fire you if you say the wrong thing in a code review.
Yeah.
So,
The one of the things that I've found interesting is I juxtapose my own journey and my own
mm,
um, imposter syndrome, which is based on my socioeconomic background and going to a
mm,
community college. I went to Portland Community College. So my sense of not belonging was like
mhm,
my first job. I show up, it's me and five other guys. They're all older than
mm.
me. So there's the age thing. And then they all went to colleges with names. You know what I mean?
Ah,
So it's like,
yeah,
oh, Duke and
I know
this and
exactly
that
what
and the
you
other
mean.
thing. And then I went to the PCC and I'm still going to school at night. So for me, going into a code review, my anxiety was like, they're going to find out that I'm an idiot.
Yeah,
You know
yeah,
what I mean?
and
And
you're not alone in that.
I think that those are reasonable things for me to explain. And if I'm on a group with five dudes and we're all from the same general neighborhood, we all grew up in Portland. And the only difference, quote unquote, difference is they had money and I didn't, and they went to schools that have names and I didn't,
Mhm.
then I think anybody of any background can understand why I would feel some kind of way going into a code review. But then I feel like if you add in gender and race and background and language and all the other pie charts of one's identity,
Mm,
that seems to trigger something in some people where they're like, well, that person shouldn't feel that way at all
mm,
because I don't see whatever. You don't see color. You don't see that. But people seem to be able to see that I went to a different college and had a different background. And those
mm,
are quote unquote valid reasons to
mhm.
be anxious. But then they invalidate the other reasons that one could potentially be anxious going into a code review.
Is there a question in here?
I guess the question is, does that make sense to you? Is that a reasonable framing for
Yeah.
me to understand why one would have anxiety and
Well,
self-efficacy
I think
issues?
absolutely. Like I think that, so you brought up a lot of things here. One thing that comes into my mind is, we can struggle to empathize with people who we don't feel like are necessarily part of our group. This is sometimes in psychology we call this us versus them. We have this
Mm.
capacity in our minds to just be like, oh my gosh, this is my in group and this is my out group, and that's sometimes very natural. Like think about going to a sports game, right? But it can be very frightening and scary as well, and it can lead people to create very large divisions along things that are really harmful for our large many cultures world. And I think that it's really insightful of you to think about the ways that you actually share a group with this other people and to say, listen, like have some empathy with me, like, see how close we are, see how I'm a man like you, and we're all these things together, but I had this different experience. That is a way in to get empathy for people. Now, of course, the challenge I think is that we need to expand to consider many, many identities in that. But I think it's a valid entry point. Yeah.
Yeah.
And an interesting
Yeah.
example, right, of sometimes we overlook certain things. I've worked with a lot of community college students, by the way, so shout out to their brilliance.
Mm. Thank you. I appreciate that. Like, I feel like community college worked out nicely for me and it can work
Yeah.
out for others, which then
Yeah.
brings me into something that I think I developed during community college, which is we are calling it technical resiliency.
Oh,
I've heard like spoons theory and like, who's got the resiliency and who doesn't. But like the
yeah.
idea that over the years, I took those experiences and was able to go and develop some sense of resiliency where like, yeah, I can go into a code review. I can go into
Mm,
a meeting and I may not know what I don't know, but I definitely know what I know. And I'm confident in that. And I want more people to get that. And I feel like
yeah.
they need to get that by not quitting the industry completely. Like the only way you can have a 30-year career in tech is by sticking around for 30 years and not getting
True.
bullied out. You know what I mean?
It's a fundamental problem. And so if we want to solve that problem, we have to ask, okay, like what is it that we can do to help people stick around long enough to become the experienced people? Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So I
And
guess my question is, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think there's multiple ways to contribute to that answer. And one way is individual level resilience. So you mentioned self-efficacy. If folks don't know what that is, it's essentially like if you have a challenging situation, unexpected friction comes up, like a code review that makes you feel really anxious. In our research, for instance, we found if you can help people build more self-efficacy for that moment, that means you believe that you will figure out how to get past it. That helps them persist, right? And life really is kind of like those little steps, like one moment more of persisting, one moment more of believing in yourself. Self-efficacy is also something that we measured in my research and found it predicts developers' productivity. So I think it's a big one.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out how do you teach that though?
Mm,
Especially, I would say that we're in a time now where attention span is also lowered. And one of the things
yeah,
that I've noticed both um, on Pluralsight, but others is that the amount of attention span that someone has used to be an hour, and
yeah,
now it's like 11 minutes. Like I,
yeah.
I run another podcast called Azure Friday. We've done 750 episodes. We did some data science on it, and people basically tune out after 11 minutes.
Uh-huh.
And I'm
Yeah.
like, that sucks. So then is the answer to take your Pluralsight course and break it up into a lot of like 11-minute chunks?
Okay, I like this. A learning engagement question. Um, so there's a couple things I would ask you in return. One is,
Please.
are there things that you see people do for more than 11 minutes?
See, that's the thing though. Like,
Right?
how do you
And
measure thing, right? Like people will be on TikTok for
yeah,
hours, but it's tiny little bursts of serotonin over a
true.
period of time.
Yeah. And I think it's fair for us to ask, okay, sometimes you have a tiny slice of attention. So let's think about getting that for tiny slices. And I used to work in education, and that was always our question was like, you have a very limited amount of time with a child in a classroom.
Mm.
And sometimes you're directly asking yourself, should this child go, play with their friends or rest their brain, or do this math exercise? Like that's the efficacy question. Is your math exercise actually a good enough 10 minutes, knowing that those 10 minutes are really valuable and finite in the time a child has in a classroom? So I think it's fair for us to ask, what can we do? In psychology, we actually do have some really interesting work on doing brief asynchronous interventions. And one way we do this is we lighten the load for people. We give you kind of a short self-efficacy exercises you can do, like right before you're going to do a code review. By the way,
Mm-hmm.
we have this. We have a workbook out there for folks. They can do this for themselves. But then you try to repeat it. And that really is key because honestly, you won't change your own behavior with like a 10-minute meditation, but you might change it if every time, you really, really worry, you start to bring yourself back to this. And so we tend to call that, mindfulness, right? We tend to call that a virtuous cycle in psychology. And a lot of the intervention work that I'm interested in focuses on how can we craft virtuous cycles. One of the things that I find super cool, almost like programmatically cool, so maybe you'll appreciate this as an engineer, is, there are gains and changes that happen just from quantity. Like, okay, we need 5 hours of exposure for someone to learn X. But there are actually categorical switches that we can make if we get someone to pull on a different set of beliefs. And I love that stuff. That stuff is my jam. I find it very hopeful. And the reason that I find it hopeful is it puts the person in the driver's seat. We've given them a different way of viewing their challenging experience. And then they are the ones who can pull on that again and again. They reinforce that cycle. So I do think small things can add up. Yeah. Long answer short to that short question, but
Yeah, yeah. One of the small things that adds up that I saw in another one of your studies
mm.
was successful hackathons and how
Oh
it
yeah.
changes how teams do stuff. Like, why is it that not coding on the thing you code on all the time and instead taking a short sprint and coding on something totally unrelated
Mhm.
would make you a better team?
Yeah. So have you ever had the experience of thinking like, I don't know what it would be for you, Scott, like, I'm this kind of guy. Like I'm X language or I'm like X, framework. I mean, I hear people kind of use this thing. Does that sound
Yeah, well,
familiar?
so I use it in a religious context. So I will
Mm,
say, like, my religion would be like C sharp, but then I try to be non-denominational and open to other religions because
cool.
I see people over there doing JavaScript or people over
Yeah.
there doing Python. They seem very happy. So it's like visiting a
Yeah.
mosque or visiting another person's church is
Yeah.
like an opportunity to see how the other half lives.
Yeah. And I consider myself a psychologist. Like, I love psychology. I love reading psychology. When I meet other psychologists out there, I'm like, yay, we share something. But, there are times when we want to be able to move that identity around and maybe be open to a different identity. So imagine you're someone who's like worked on a product team and you've always kind of thought, maybe I could, do some coding, but you haven't quite brought it to your job yet, and bringing it to your job, there's a lot of reasons you wouldn't. You don't want to be embarrassed. You are facilitating a relationship with your manager. Maybe you're kind of contemplating, I could change something, we thought it was really fun to study hackathons because hackathons almost create like a psychologically safe way for people to experiment with new roles without
Mm.
like all the overload of, okay, I really want to take this step and I'm going to convince my boss and all that stuff. Like, I think the temporary team experience of a hackathon is really neat. And what we saw was, a lot of folks who actually worked on running the hackathon, our engineers at Pluralsight who were responsible for running the hackathon, they came to my research lab and they were curious, like, how can we measure the impacts of the hackathon, to justify that it's worth doing? And we were like, okay, we were actually thinking about participating in the hackathon ourselves as a research team. So let's hack the hackathon. That's how our experiment took place. And what we wanted to do was to show that, even if the hackathon didn't result in product features or those sorts of innovation outcomes that we typically might talk about in a business, although those do happen, we had person centered outcomes that actually really mattered. So we saw that, if people were on a supportive team, they were more willing to try new skills after the hackathon. And, Pluralsight's all about, understanding and encouraging these cultures of upskilling. So that was a really cool thing to measure. Again, it was happening. It was just like no one had ever thought to measure it before. So,
So the Developer Success Labs
mm,
is a group within Pluralsight. And I have friends that are Pluralsight authors. They've made
mhm.
classes 10, 15 years ago. I made a bunch of Pluralsight classes. Do the people making the classes apply the learnings that your lab creates to make their courses better?
I hope so. I mean, we're still pretty young. So I founded it just lab, one word, Developer Success Lab.
Hmm.
I would love to be in a place where I'm running multiple labs.
My bad. My bad.
Yeah. Lab Empire, we can look forward to that.
Hmm.
So we put out public facing work on, topics that we think will help lift up the industry. I do believe that Pluralsight authors have engaged with our research. I have not yet. Maybe this is an aspirational goal for me. I haven't yet seen our research actually mentioned in a Pluralsight course, I think, although we've contributed some content to a lot of stuff like, tech skills days and things like that that we run in the industry. Yeah.
Okay. One question I wanted to ask that might be a little bit off topic, but it's in the space of how people learn and how people think. There
Mm.
was an interesting Hacker News blog that kind of went viral. That was
Uh-oh.
well, there's some value in
No, I'm
when
just being silly. Yeah.
certain blogs show up, and it was a plea to junior developers using Gen AI coding assistance.
Oh.
So my first impression was like, oh, this is like old man who shakes fist at cloud.
Mm.
But the first sentence hit me. The early years of your career shape the kind of developer you'll become.
Mm.
That's when you build problem solving skills and knowledge that set you apart as an average engineer versus an excellent engineer.
Yeah.
But what if all those formative years are outsourced to an AI that does the thinking for you?
Mm.
So the question is, I guess to you, and I don't know if there's any data on this yet, or it's just an emerging space, is you remember when calculators came out and they were like, hey, look, it's a
Yeah.
TI 89, like, and it's going to make it so you don't know how to do trigonometry.
Yeah.
Like, I remember they made us graph on paper and then we could use the calculator. Is there a correlation between Gen AI tool uses and critical thinking or systems thinking skills? Cognitive offloading.
Yeah. And I've seen some research on the possibility that using a Gen AI tool will create cognitive offloading. So for listeners, cognitive offloading essentially means, you're not actively solving some parts of the problem. Like automating away some of the cognition. It can be bad and it can be good,
Hmm.
right? And I
Yeah.
think the problem is that the tool's not going to give us this answer. So I've been interested in this, and I ran a research study. We gathered up data from over 2,000 software developers, and I think 795 engineering managers actually, who
Wow.
often get left out of this question. But
That's huge.
yeah, they are actually really an interesting group with Gen AI as well. So I was really interested in us better understanding what I would call like a rapid technology shift. And one thing that I thought was whether or not you're using these tools, you are still in the middle of this big conversation about whether being a software developer is changing in this moment. So you're thinking to yourself, does my manager expect me to work differently? Do my peers expect me to work differently? Like, what do they want from me? And this is especially true for junior developers. So we found a couple of things. Like, one thing that I think is really important is we saw a huge number of developers have something that I called AI skill threat. So when they imagine, you ask them to imagine a future of AI coding, those tools being really pervasively used, they tend to agree with things like, I'm not going to be able to keep up. Other people
Mm.
aren't going to evaluate me fairly. This is, again, that quantification game of psychology.
Right.
And we saw, I think, about between 43% or 45% of developers across this large sample of 3,000 people say yes. And being a manager did not fix this. So people are feeling, I think, threatened in this moment. Now, I'm going to give you a little hope, though, because we found something that really seems to help. We also measured, remember, I told you about sense of belonging. We
Mm-hmm.
measured whether people felt like they were on a team that really cared about their sense of belonging. They were welcome as a whole person. The team cared about that culture. And we measured a second thing, one of my favorites, whether you felt like your engineering team was really positioned to learn. Like they set learning goals together as a team. Your manager supports your learning. You're not hiding it on Fridays or whatever else is happening when you know
Right.
you need
Right.
to
Right.
learn, right?
Sneaking your learning.
Yeah. So folks who had access to that culture, they cut their AI skill threat in half, essentially. So you were twice as likely to have AI skill threat if you did not have those cultures around you.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
I'm interested also. I believe this to be intuitive, but I don't know it to be true. That using the Socratic method with an AI can make you a better programmer, but simply having it make code for you just makes you an expert beginner.
yeah. I think one of the things you're pointing out is like, who's in the driver's seat? Do you
Yeah.
have agency, right? And I think it feels for me as someone who studies human problem solving, right? It feels very different when I imagine someone using these tools and being in charge and using what we call metacognitive skills. So you're thinking to yourself, am I getting what I want? Is this right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, that is so true. A true story. And I'm not an AI bro by any means, but I am recognizing that if I'm going to
Safe space.
talk to myself my theory is if I'm going to talk to myself in the mirror anyway, it'd be helpful if the thing gave me some information back.
Yeah.
So my 17-year-old is taking AP Bio, and I needed to effectively page in my AP Bio from 30 years ago. So how do I
Mm.
get up to speed to help him? So I sat down with a ChatGPT and I put it in audio mode. I info dumped my age, my context, what I knew, what I didn't know. I told it everything I didn't know about biology. And I basically imagined like a Tetris field with like all of my fragmented knowledge. And I said, help me fill this in. And I
Oh.
spent 2 hours having it interview and quiz me to get me up to speed
Ah.
on biology rather than thinking about it in terms of like throwing the questions
Yeah.
at it. And kind of the idea of an infinitely patient tutor works for me more than
Oh, yeah.
generate this sorting algorithm.
I mean, it works for me too. Way before I'd ever heard of anything being called AI. When I was a postdoc, we were really interested in the idea of personalized tutors. Like,
Mm.
it's always been that human ability to dialogue. I love how spatial, by the way, that metaphor was that was like very insightful and cool.
Thank you.
Um, yeah,
That's how my brain works, I'm afraid.
yeah, I love that. It's really cool. And there's some great research from back in the day, like classic learning science stuff that says, your brain is not just an empty bucket and then you fill it with content and then that's learning and then it's done. Actually, retrieving the information that we've learned is complicated. There's all of these interesting kind of really neat ways that we can get better at it. So, one fun thing is called the spacing effect. Like you learn material better if you sort of space it out and you continually expose yourself. Add this back to the small chunks thing, right?
100%.
So our minds are complicated, and I love the idea of a future where technology does cognitive scaffolding, maybe more than cognitive offloading. And I love the idea of that future. I do worry that they're not bringing enough learning scientists in the room when they make these tools, but
I'm not a learning scientist, but I respect the work that you all are doing very much. I met with the school board recently in my local area here, and they have no idea how AI works. And I explained to them to use it as an augmenter, as like imagine you all have a TA, and that's the way you should think about it, rather than kids cheating on essays, which is the wrong way to think about it.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's important that we in tech remain respectful of the work of teachers, right? The context, like you're clearly very in tune with that, right? And then they kind of come back to us and say, well, like design something about this differently. Like my perspective is, the answer is never going to be in the tool. The answer is in the real world, in how people are using the tool. And then asking yourself, okay, like why are these people thriving with this tool and these other people seem to really be having a bad time?
Thank you so much for your time and for your insights and for your research and for spending your afternoon with me today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for the time.
We've been chatting with Dr. Kat Hicks. You can check out her website at drkathicks.com and the Pluralsight Developer Success Lab. This has been another episode of Hansel Minutes, and we'll see you again next week.